So let's talk about all these parameters. Let's also talk about the dollar weakness, how that impacts India, and how really our emerging markets is a cluster position. We've got with us Anantha Nageswaran. He's the EAC-PM member. Mr. Nageswaran, thanks so much for taking the time out and joining in. What is your own sense? While, we equity market trackers are following a completely different story, but it's ground reality. Is there still a lot of pain in the economy, though still FY21 GDP is seen contracting 7 to 12%? What do you think can be done really to try and revive the economy?
Thank you for having me on the show. I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not as a member of the EAC-PM, nor do my views reflect the views of Government of India. It's my personal view. So yes, the fog of uncertainty still remains very thick, and it will be very premature. It will just be a shot in the dark or just a wild guess for me to say whether the numbers would be between 7 and 12%. To pick a number in between, it is just anybody's guess. And certainly, I think from the Indian standpoint, looking at high-frequency indicators and looking at the kind of structural reforms that have been done in the last couple of weeks or three, it is possible to make the case that 21-22 could be a better year from the Indian standpoint. But there are global headwinds that could come in the way. So I think, therefore, positive factors are emerging in the domestic economy, but I think international factors still remain largely headwinds rather than tailwinds.
Sure, understand that. The RBI, on the other hand, has front-loaded rate cuts clearly, while the RBI governor has said that there is a room for monetary stimulus and, he's going to be using the space judiciously. How much difference can an additional 50 bips rate cut really mean for the economy, if at all that comes by?
I don't know whether I heard the entire question because I only started hearing you from the moment you mentioned RBI. But before that, if you had said something, I didn't hear it. But in any case, your point is well taken that a 50 basis point rate cut may or may not make a difference. There could be more room for regulatory actions like the kind of measures they announced on what would constitute priority sector lending, including lending to startups, etc. So there are many such measures, whether it is on moratorium or whether interest on interest is calculated, all these things will make a big difference, along with the fact that if the RBI were to consider, or the government together with the RBI were to allow banks to offer interest rate subvention to some class of borrowers, MSMEs or withdrawal loan borrowers, etc. Those are the kinds of measures that would definitely help the economy, whereas a rate cut per se, unless there is a transmission down the line, it may not make a difference to the revival of spending in the economy, whether it is consumption spending or investment spending.
Good morning, Nikunj Dalme also joining in. I'm not trying to draw you towards political water, but purely as a market commentator, and when I speak to some observers, they get slightly baffled when you see that the RBI is not been, or government in this case has not been able to close the MPC committee members' name before the deadline. There are times when vacancies at PSU banks is left vacant for many months now. Even appointment of deputy governors sometimes takes many months. Some would argue that why the process has not been followed. Is that means we don't have talent, or what is the deal?
I really have no comments to offer on this one. I'm reading the same news that you are reading or you are hearing, so I really can't say anything on this. I'm afraid.
Okay. I'll also like to draw your attention to currently what central bankers have. And I'm talking about a very global phenomenon here, which is that most of the central banks have a very large exposure to US Treasury. That's how the reserves are passed, including India. Now, we know where the rate of return is. If we are in a zero rate environment and if RBI has to invest and has to keep on giving dividend to the government. Do you think it is time to diversify? I'm asking you perhaps a question which will not have ramifications for tomorrow or next quarter, but this is something you need to think, people need to think through it, because I'm yet to pick up anything very differentiated from any big central banker who are admitting that bond yields have come down, US treasuries at 0%, we need to diversify.
Oh, that's a good question, and I have raised them in my own columns in Mint in the last 2-3 weeks. Yes, you are right about the zero yield. I mean, close to zero. I mean, U.S. Treasury still offers 10-year Treasury still offers close to 0.7% annual yield. But that said, yeah, the yields have been coming down the last 20 years since 2001 when the Fed lowered the interest rate to 1%. So holding forex reserves in dollars often that matter is worse, even if you are going to hold euros. Definitely we are moving away from Bretton Woods 2, which was an informal arrangement with dollar as the anchor currency. And when the anchor country decides to go for a massive liquidity infusion and printing of money, whichever way you want to call it, printing or creating more reserves, whatever, and currency debasement, formally notified or not, is on the table, and it is being replicated by other international currencies, then the policy of continuing to accumulate reserves has a different cost-benefit framework than it used to have before. And it is difficult for me to say that the alternative, which is to let the currency appreciate and not intervene, is a completely unalloyed blessing. Definitely there are, as you put it, you need a different framework. We need to have discussion papers. We need to look at the longer term implications, because this is not a cyclical phenomenon. I think it is going to remain with us throughout this decade, that the developed country currencies are going to pursue inflation and hence currency debasement. And therefore, we need a different approach. And it is difficult to say off the cuff that an alternative is decidedly better or the status quo is still preferable. It needs a very serious consideration, because we are not looking at a cyclical but a structural phenomenon here.
Okay, I'm just moving from left to right and changing topics, because I always look forward to interaction. So I'm just trying to get a range of thoughts on a variety of subjects. Sure. So I'm going to come back to India again. And let's talk about the 4 pillars of the economy, which everybody knows: exports, consumption, government spending, and then you've got the corporate spending. Unfortunately, all the 4 pillars are shaking. Exports for obvious reasons, consumption because of economy, private sector capex because nobody wants to take a risk, and government is slow because they don't have money. I mean, there's nothing they can do about it if GST collections and other tax collections drop. So what is the way out? Because historically, we've seen that one pillar or the other wheel always keeps on working. Right now, I see a situation that it's a car with 4 wheels. It is in a stationary position or perhaps is in first gear.
So, Nikunj, in terms of laying out the problems, you have done a fantastic job, and therefore it is difficult for me to say, and you have given the answer yourself. If all the 4 wheels are hobbled by different reasons, then actually the fallout is what we see in the growth rate, and it is not something that is peculiar to India at this point. Even before the COVID struck, and when a lot of commentators were talking about India's growth rates having slowed down sharply, one thing they failed to see was that this growth slowdown phenomena wasn't peculiar to India. And since 2010, if you look at 8 or 9 large emerging economies, all of them had slowed down quite sharply since 2010 growth rates. So clearly there is something more structural at work. The developed country demand wasn't there, even though their asset markets were juiced up considerably by the quantitative easing policies and low interest rate policies. So we need to therefore follow a policy of opportunistic avenues to grow. There are some sectors that are doing well, and the government was also pushing, whether it is credit guarantees or direct fiscal infusion or structural reforms. So the government is following a multitude of policy approaches here. Naturally, economies do take time to react. There is a lag effect, number one. And number two, the underlying uncertainty with respect to what people want to do in terms of stepping out, even if somebody offers work, I should be willing to go out to the field and work if I'm going to be hobbled by the fear of catching an infection. Even if the government wants to kickstart its own infrastructure spending project, it needs to find workers. And the same thing goes with spending. So therefore, naturally, while we can all talk of actions, and the important thing is there is going to be a huge gap between the action and the effect on the ground, both in terms of time and in terms of the fear factor coming into play here. So we need to therefore keep pushing the levers and keep pulling the levers, and I think at some point in time when the uncertainty dissipates, then there will be a sort of a pent-up effect of these actions taken in the last few months that will show up in the economy in a positive way. That is the best characterization I can give of the current situation.
Okay, sure. Some policymakers have suggested unusual measures such as deficit monetization, for example, if the bond market doesn't support that borrowing funded stimulus. What's your view, or any other measure you feel has yet been unexplored while everyone continues to focus on fiscal versus monetary?
So, I mean, the deficit monetization comes into play partly because of the fact that one doesn't want to increase market borrowings beyond the enhanced borrowings already announced, because the impact it would have on the bond market. However, we know that, of course, the monetization doesn't come without its own potential costs, possible costs, whether it is the impact on currency or the inflation risk premium on the bond market, etc. But again, as we said, we are facing extraordinary situation, not the normal cyclical economic slowdown here. And yes, emerging economies are treated differently by the financial markets globally when they do monetization compared to when developed countries do. So that is justified or not, that is accumulated credibility that they are able to monetize in some sense. So we need to have a monetization program that is sensitive to all these dimensions. Therefore, it should be one-off, it should be limited rather than open-ended. And we can try it. And if the market reaction is extremely unfavorable, then of course we can pare it back, etc. So while structuring it, the communication should be very clear that it is not open-ended fiscal dominance of monetary policy. We experienced that between 2009 and 13, and we paid the price for it with the massive Indian rupee depreciation in 2013. So I have written in favor of a limited monetization, just a limited amount and limited time frame, and this will provide a clarity to the government in terms of available resources. And then the spending can be ramped up. But right now, even though the RBI is very creatively supporting the government in its borrowing programs, it is still relatively uncertain in terms of the magnitudes. And it's sort of we will take it as we will sort of take one step at a time kind of attitude. Whereas a clear one-off monetization program gives clarity to the government on the amount of resources available. And that probably is a very important uncertainty to be removed at this point in time. So in that sense, I am in favor of it, and I have written about it.
Okay, great. What did you make of the entire delay as well in the monetary policy due to the delay in appointing MPC members? Do you think this situation could have been avoided? Just wanted to get your view on that.
No, Nikunj asked me that question, and I said I have no comments to offer on this one because, as I said, everybody knows what is being reported in the media, etc. And yeah, I mean, there isn't anything new for me to add which would be original insight into the situation.
Okay. Why do you think in India bond rates are still at 6%? I mean, I'm using US bond yield as a reference. The gap between the US 10-year paper and India, which always was at about 300 bips or 250 bips, is now at an historic high. Is it because markets are not convinced about the ability of the bond market or the government to pay back? The yields which are offered by countries where debt is high and which have a default history, their yields are much better. So what is the structural problem with the yields in India?
Which country you think where the default track record is worse than India's and have a lower rate? Talking about Europe or sorry?
Europe. Not Argentina.
No, I mean,
Argentina, I'm not getting there.
No, there it's completely different. I mean, the ECB is buying them, and I agree with you. I mean, whether the bond yield of Greece, etc., should be lower than India's, and that's a very, very difficult question to answer. How the bond market is treating them, etc. But therefore, we need to compare against developing country peers. And I remember Dr. Arvind Subramaniam, when he was the chief economic advisor, did comment about the credit rating of India and China. And if you look at the annual IMF Article 4 assessments, they come up with their own estimates of government debt and deficit for China, which is far worse than the official estimates. But the so-called efficient financial markets pay no heed to such nuanced analysis. So I'm not necessarily going to say that the financial markets are pretty intelligent in some sense in figuring out the long-term implications and risk and long-term risk assessments. We know that from the frequent stock market bubbles that we encounter. And the same thing goes in the bond market as well. So we need to put India's bond yield in the context of what is happening in other emerging economies. And I don't think India's bond yields are particularly high in that sense.
I'll also just wrap it up with one small point,
Sure.
which is that right now we are staring at an environment where the world wants inflation.
Yeah.
Given that there is going to be an asset price inflation, which naturally will happen because of low interest rates, whenever inflation will come back, do you think it will be difficult for us to control it and tame it? Because when inflation comes back, so you know it more than anyone else, it can get out of hand.
Well, I think the developed world is yearning for high inflation, but it is not going to happen just because they print so much of money or promise to keep interest rates at zero or below zero, whatever, because the underlying issue for inflation is the labor bargaining power. And this pandemic, compared to the previous episodes of pandemics or even the Black Death, hasn't shrunk the supply of labor. And in fact, if anything, it has made women unemployment even higher than before. And therefore, to that extent, labor supply has gone up and labor uncertainty has gone up rather than reduced. So therefore, bringing inflation back is not going to happen, no matter central bankers are very desperate for it, because that is how they're going to bring down the mountain of government debt over the years, and plus contingent obligations. But the reality is, post 2024, it could happen, because what I see happening between in the next 4 years is a struggle for the dominance of public policy between interest of capital and interest of labor. Eventually, I feel labor will manage to get back on the ascendancy over capital in the developed world, and therefore inflation outcome being a lot higher than what it is today is something for the second half of the 2020s. And yes, if it does begin to rise, it will get out of hand. And the so-called long-term discounting mechanisms of the financial markets are simply not focused on that.
So appreciate your time. Always look forward to engaging interaction, and we've really covered a range of topics from bond yields to perhaps what central bankers to do. So it's been a very, I wouldn't say 360-degree, but a discussion where we really covered almost all the relevant global and local points.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation too. Thank you very much. Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.